Hello everyone, and welcome to the second National Archaeology Week webinar presented by the Australian Archaeological Association. I'll just begin by acknowledging the country that I am on at present, which is the country of the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation. All of this week, AAA is presenting a seminar each day to shine a spotlight on a different aspect of Australian archaeology and archaeology by Australian archaeologists. My name is Fenella. I'm one of the coordinators for National Archaeology Week, and we have Dr. Caroline Spry and Paul Gale. Caroline's as co-hosts. Caroline is the Victorian and Joint National Coordinator for National Archaeology Week, and Paul Gale is a representative of the AAA Outreach and Engagement Committee. Just before we start, I've got a few little housekeeping things. This is a recorded presentation, and we just ask that all attendees pop your questions in the Q&A rather than in chat. And a reminder to co-hosts and the presenter to turn off your video and audio when you're not presenting. So today we have Dr. Matt Carter, who's a marine archaeologist, and he's worked on and led projects in 12 countries. He combines his archaeological and commercial and technical diving qualifications and experience to investigate potentially polluting wrecks through the Pacific. He's the research director of the Major Projects Foundation, a marine research and conservation not-for-profit organisation, and they have a focus on deploying engineering solutions to protect ecosystems and cultural heritage in the Pacific. So welcome, Matt, and thank you very much for presenting, and I'll invite you to get started.
Okay, thank you very much for that warm welcome, Fenella. You just disappeared there for a second. Are you ready for me to share my screen?
I'm sorry about that, Matt. Yes, I am.
I'm not sure if it was your one or my one. Yeah, that's
perfect.
We can make this work. Okay, is that showing there now?
Yep, that's perfect now.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking from tonight. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'd also just really like to thank the organisers for the opportunity to be part of the Australian Archaeological Association's National Archaeology Week. I think this is a really great initiative, and to connect, I guess, what we do as archaeologists with you, members of the public, whose heritage that we're actually lucky enough to spend our working days investigating. So thank you to the organisers, and also thank you for the attendees for coming along tonight. Now, at this point, I have to admit I'm here on slightly false pretenses. While this is an Australian Archaeological Association event, some of you will have picked up from my accent that I'm in fact a Kiwi. So kia ora, welcome. Also, as you can see up here, I'm a maritime archaeologist, which means my speciality is it sits slightly outside of the traditional area of interest and I guess membership of AAA. And finally, while some of my research is Australian based, as you'll see shortly, much of it is actually centred around our neighbours in the Pacific. Now, hopefully after that confession, I haven't lost too many attendees. And for those of you who are still here, I appreciate your tolerance. So tonight, I want to start my presentation by discussing something that I'm incredibly passionate about. Some would actually say obsessed, and that is maritime archaeology. Now, as you can see here, I've provided a bit of a definition that I think best kind of captures the direction and purpose of this discipline. And that is the study of the physical remains of past human interactions with the oceans, lakes, and rivers of the world. Now, I mean, it's a pretty broad, kind of far-reaching definition that I've provided there. But for me, maritime archaeology provides, a range of different tools to investigate those aspects of the past that not only am I most interested in, but as you will see, also provides the potential to solve some of the world's greatest challenges, including those facing our oceans today. So really quite big reps, but as I go through my presentation, hopefully it will become clear more about what I mean. So I want to describe now in a bit more detail how maritime archaeology has traditionally operated in this part of the world. And of course, as the Vice President of the Australasian Institute for Maritime Archaeology, I will look to promote our organisation as well. We're always looking for new members, and details can be found at our website there. But looking at how maritime archaeology has developed in Australia. Now, Australia it's globally recognised as one of the leaders in maritime archaeology. And this dates back to around about the 1970s, where researchers started working in this space, especially from the Western Australian Maritime Museum. In subsequent years, we had other organisations start getting involved, such as Flinders University, the Australian National Maritime Museum, amongst others. And one of the great things about this, over the decades, they've investigated literally hundreds of shipwrecks all across the region, uncovering aspects of our past that simply could not be discovered in any other way. And as you can see on the bottom bullet point there, maritime archaeology in Australia has made enormous contributions to these studies of colonialism, capitalism, and the modern world, how we understand the country of Australia and New Zealand, and a whole range of different research areas. Now, during these projects, these researchers develop tools and techniques that I would argue provide huge potential, not only for revealing our past, but also for solving wider global challenges. And this brings me to my next slide. Now, for those of you who are rightly puzzled about the title of this presentation, I have another concept I'd like to discuss, and that is what's known as the Anthropocene. Now, I've provided another definition below, and as you can see, basically the concept of the Anthropocene is the recognition that the impact of human activities in recent history is so great that we have become the primary agents of ecological change on a global scale. Now, various scientists will argue, when this impact became so great that it deserves its own title, its own geological epoch. And some of them will say that it actually started from the pollution generated from the Industrial Revolution, while others claim fallout from the atomic age marks the start of the Anthropocene period. Now, to be honest, to me, that's not the most important issue. The most important issue for me isn't when the Anthropocene started, but more the power of this concept to motivate us to turn our attention as academics or as an informed public towards understanding who and what is responsible for the ecological changes going on around us and in the past, and most significantly, how we can act to reduce those changes. Now, as I mentioned, and hopefully it should be pretty clear by now, my main interest in all of this is the ocean. And even the most land-focused of us will know that humans have had and continue to have an enormous impact on the health of our seas, whether it's overfishing, ocean plastics, acidification, or a whole range of other polluting activities. humans are undeniably the primary agents of ecological change within our oceans. Okay, so many of you are probably thinking you've turned up to the wrong presentation. Instead of talking about maritime archaeology and shipwrecks, here I am ranting about ecological destruction and the end of the world. But stick with me, there is a link, there is a method to my madness. Okay, so we've discussed this concept of the Anthropocene, which is basically the recognition that human activities are the primary force of ecological change in both land and marine ecosystems. Now, with this in mind, as the study of past human interactions with the oceans, I would argue that maritime archaeology has a critical role to play in investigating not only the causes of these changes, but also working to actively reduce those changes to our oceans today. Now, with that being said, I want to provide a bit of a case study of how I'm using the tools that I've learned as a maritime archaeologist to work within the study area of the Anthropocene. And this is specifically through my research at the Major Projects Foundation, investigating what's known as potentially polluting shipwrecks and our work throughout the Pacific. Now, most of you won't have heard of MPF, so I have a short video here to introduce who we are and what we do.
The Major Projects Foundation was formed by a team of volunteers, including divers, sailors, engineers, archaeologists and biologists, united by a common love of the sea and concern for its future. The foundation owns and operates the RV Ocean Recovery, a full capability research, dive support and subsea construction vessel. Our mission is to provide a platform to support marine research and environmental education in the Pacific, and to take positive, practical action to preserve and protect our oceans and our island communities. One of the first issues that we are investigating is the little known but potentially devastating threat of oil leaking from World War II shipwrecks.
Okay, and we'll stop it there. So that's, I guess, who we are and what we do. But I'd like to acknowledge at this point that this work that we're doing to investigate potentially polluting wrecks, it's not been undertaken in isolation. On the contrary, it's actually been undertaken in partnership with an organisation called the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environmental Program, SPREP. Now, for those of you who may not have heard about SPREP, it is a regional organisation comprising 21 Pacific Island member countries and 5 developed countries. And the thing is, SPREP is charged with protecting and managing the environment and natural resources of the Pacific. So their remit actually includes the control of marine pollution, and that's where their interest and I guess the issue of potentially polluting wrecks comes under their umbrella. So as you can see in the slide here, these are the countries which are represented by SPREP, and their distribution covers an enormous part of the globe. So we are dealing with a multinational organisation with a huge span across the Pacific Ocean. I'd also like to mention our developing partnership with an organisation called the Ocean Foundation. And this is still quite a new relationship, but it does potentially represent, you know, amazing possibilities for mitigating the threat that potentially polluting wrecks pose within this region of the world. Now, you will have heard me mention the term potentially polluting shipwrecks, PPWs. Now, at its most basic, PPW is any shipwreck that contains oil and or other forms of polluting substances, so either as cargo or as fuel. Now, under that definition, basically any modern shipwreck is a PPW. A tinny that's sunk on the rocks is a PPW. So we refine this slightly, and at the Major Projects Foundation, this is the definition of a PPW that we look at. So This allows us, I guess, to focus on wrecks that fit a definition, which I guess are deemed to pose more of a significant oil pollution threat. So based on that definition, it is the larger shipwrecks through time that do have that potential to hold significant quantities of toxic materials. So moving on, this brings us to the Pacific. Now, as many of you will know, the Pacific War was a maritime war, and it brought more people, equipment, and machines, including ships, into the region than any other time in human history. So, during this war, thousands of ships were sunk across the Pacific, and when we start looking at them, 3,800 of those fit that previous definition of a potentially polluting wreck, being over 400 gross registers tonne and holding quantities of oil. And what you can see is when they're plotted out like this, the densities and their locations, they can be seen to reflect the major campaigns of the Pacific War. So quite a notable point there. Now, back in 2005, marine pollution experts investigated the records of those 3,800 shipwrecks with the idea to create estimates of how much oil they may still contain. Now, through this work, they came up with a low estimate of 510,000 tonnes, or around 570 million litres, for those of us who don't work in tonnes, and a high estimate of 4.1 million tonnes, or 4.5 billion litres. Now, the likely volume they still hold is somewhere between those two numbers. But even so, even if it is that low estimate, it means there could be an enormous volume of oil still on these shipwrecks to this day. So to put this into some context, some of you may have heard about the grounding of the MV Solomon Trader in the Solomon Islands in 2019. Now, this resulted in the spilling of between 80 to 300 tonnes of oil, so 90,000 to 330,000 litres of bunker oil. Now, according to international standards, this is considered a medium-sized spill, but even the cost of cleaning up this medium spill has been estimated at around about $50 million, while economic losses may be up to an additional $40 million on top of that. Now, why this is so important is that it highlights the vulnerability of the Pacific to such spills. Now, elsewhere in the world, a spill of this size is likely to have been able to be cleaned up relatively quickly. But in this case, the oil spill response teams, they had to be mobilised from Singapore and here from Australia. And a month after it had run aground, this vessel was still leaking oil. Okay, and this brings me to my next slide. I mean, we all know that oil in the marine environment is a bad thing, but just how bad depends on a whole range of different factors, including some that you can see here. Now, I guess one of the things that really struck me when I started researching and moving into this area of study was that oil doesn't have to be spilled in huge volumes, like you can see in the picture there, to cause damage to ecosystems. Because what I found out was that even relatively small leaks over time can cause chronic poisoning to the marine environment if they reach above a certain threshold. So it doesn't have to be kind of this kind of picture or the BP deep horizon oil spill to actually cause significant damage. And what we find, as well as the obvious environmental impact of oil spills, we find that they can also cause a wide range of both short and long-term negative impacts. And some of these impacts are particularly damaging within a Pacific context. For example, those aspects that impact the social and cultural parts of life in the Pacific, and also the economies of these island nations, which are all heavily dependent on marine resources. So again, just showing how vulnerable the Pacific is to a disaster such as an oil spill. And this brings us to the billion-dollar question. When will these 3,800 shipwrecks found throughout the Pacific actually collapse? Now, the answer to this is that we simply don't know. But it is worth noting that in the Pacific, potentially polluting wrecks from the Second World War, they have been underwater for at least 76 years. And this brings us to some really great, really great studies that were undertaken back in the early 2000s. Now, corrosion scientists from the Western Australian Maritime Museum, they began investigating potentially polluting wrecks in Chuuk Lagoon, up in the Federated States of Micronesia. And the whole idea behind this was to investigate this question, how fast were these shipwrecks corroding? So what they did a whole range of different diving kind of scientific experiments and collected a whole range of corrosion data. And from this, they concluded that many of the wrecks in Chuuk Lagoon will undergo significant collapse between 2021 and 2025. So right in this period that we're in now. And as you can see in this slide here, those predictions of collapse, they are being played out in Chuuk Lagoon, with various reports of parts of these wrecks beginning to collapse. Now, at this point, one of the questions I quite often get is that if these wrecks have been underwater for so long, wouldn't all of the oil have leaked out by now anyhow? And the answer is, in some cases, absolutely, without a doubt. Where the tanks, where the ships are in particular circumstances, where the tanks have all been ruptured, then the oil will have been spilled. But the thing is, that is definitely not the case for all wrecks. And I want to briefly give you the example of the USS Mississauga that you can see up here. So when the ship sank in 1944, it was broken into two pieces. Fast forward through to 2001, and it actually leaked around 75,000 to 100,000 litres of oil, which was picked up by the local population, and the fact that this was happening was communicated through to the US Navy. So the US Navy undertook a couple of projects on the wreck to patch up the leaks for a start, and then in 2004 came back to remove the oil that was remaining in the wreck. So 2004 they turned up and they undertook a process which you can see there, using divers to drill holes in the hull, attach pumps and actually suck the oil out onto a waiting barge. Now in this way they removed 5,600 tonnes, which turns into an additional converts to 6 million litres. So in this example, enormous quantities of oil remained inside that wreck for decades, and with the risk of that being spilled if the Navy hadn't removed it. So definitely a particular case there which shows that not all of these wrecks lose their oil, quite the opposite. Now, another question I get asked is that if these wrecks continue corroding, won't the oil be released in small amounts through pinhole cracks, that kind of thing, which will then be diluted and weathered as it makes its way through the water column to the surface, with the idea that that won't cause environmental damage. And again, in some cases, this is what's happened. But as I mentioned before, even small leaks, if they reach a certain threshold, will cause chronic poisoning of the surrounding marine ecosystem. And unfortunately, due to the consequences of the Anthropocene, it looks like we may be moving towards a more catastrophic situation, which I'll discuss over the next couple of slides. Now, what you can actually see here, it might be a little bit difficult without a bit more information, but it's a video shot inside a shipwreck, looking up into the upper parts of the hull. And these bubbles, and this is actually oil that's escaped from the tanks and is now sitting trapped inside the hull. So yeah, not a lovely sight to see. So, as we were discussing before regarding the corrosion aspect, the potentially polluting wrecks in the Pacific, they are corroding and they will eventually collapse. It is inevitable. The question now is what happens when the impacts of the Anthropocene, specifically human-induced climate change, which has already been experienced throughout the Pacific, what happens when this alters the equilibrium of the environments in which the wrecks are located? So going back to the scenario where oil is being slowly released from steadily corroding PPW through pinholes and the rest of it, we now have to consider that in the past 60 years, the Pacific region has experienced more than 2,400 tropical cyclones, which is around about 41 per year. Now, significantly, the changing climate in the region is predicted to amplify the magnitude of these cyclones in the future, with a corresponding increase in wave strength. And you can see on that map there the location and the intensity of these cyclones. So increasing intensity of these storm systems, and this suggests that there's an increasing probability of potentially polluting wrecks catastrophically collapsing from these storm events in the future, with the potential to release much larger volumes of oil than that slow trickle that some wrecks do experience. And to complicate this situation further, climate change is acting to multiply the risk that oil spills from these wrecks pose, in particular in relation to disaster preparedness and resilience. So, as I was describing before, climate change is likely to increase the intensity of cyclones throughout the Pacific, and also the waves generated from such events. And it's these waves that have the potential to cause the potentially polluting wrecks to catastrophically collapse and release the oil that they still hold. Now, in the Pacific, authorities, they may be prepared to respond to the impacts of cyclones on land. These happen quite frequently. I mean, they're incredibly destructive and terrible, but they do have a range of processes in place to respond to that. Likewise, they may have processes in place to respond to oil spills, including from potentially polluting wrecks. But when these events are happening together, it's likely to be too much for even the most well-prepared and resilient Pacific nation. And I guess while this does present a worst-case scenario, as the wrecks continue to corrode and the storms do continue to become more intense across the region, the catastrophic collapse and release of oil from these wrecks in this way is becoming more likely. So yeah, that's that multiplying effect. Okay, so with all of that doom and gloom being said, what is actually being done to proactively prevent this disaster? Now, as I mentioned before, the Major Projects Foundation, we're working in partnership with SPREP with a long-term goal of mitigating the impact that these wrecks will have. Now, while there are a huge range of challenges to this work, one of the advantages we do have is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and we can look to overseas examples of best practice and apply that to the Pacific. So elsewhere in the world, I said there was 3,800 of these shipwrecks around the Pacific. In total globally, there's around about 8,400. So it's not just a Pacific problem. And overseas, in the likes of North America, in the Baltic, around the UK, governments have had more resourcing and directed that towards this question. So one of the great things we can do is take their standard operating procedures, their best practice, and apply that to the Pacific. And what we find is that it's kind of broken down into three major ways of doing things. And the first of these is prioritizing. So as I said before, 3,800 shipwrecks, just an enormous amount. We needed to prioritise that down to those which are the most high risk. So at major projects, we've done that through a range of investigation of historic archival material, talking to divers, getting all the information we can. And from that, we've narrowed that down to a list of 55 Category 1 potentially polluting wrecks. And you can see their distribution across the Pacific there. You'll note, hopefully, that 4 in Australia, they're not actually located in the middle of Australia. They are around the coast, but for ease of the map there, that's where they are. So moving on to that second point, this is kind of what we're in the middle of at the moment. It's actually trying to get more information so we can evaluate just how much of a risk these wrecks pose. So part of that is undertaking desk-based environmental assessments, and then moving through to that baseline condition assessment, which is the critical in-field gathering of information about the condition of the wreck, and also aspects of on-site environmental survey to see how susceptible the environment surrounding the wrecks are to hydrocarbons, to an oil spill. Now, all of this kind of combines together into that third point, which allows us to basically take 3 options: do nothing, which is essentially the status quo, through to active monitoring, through to that removal of oil, which I showed you briefly with the USS Mississauga, that practice of getting the divers in, pumping out the oil and removing the threat. So that's, I guess, kind of the major steps. And what I've got for you next is just a bit of a case study, again, of some of the work that we've done in the Pacific through, I guess, the area we've focused most of our attention to date. And that is Chuuk Lagoon in the Federated States of Micronesia. So through our research, we've identified this area as having the largest concentration of potentially polluting shipwrecks in the Pacific. Now, Chuuk, formerly known as Truk, was the main base of the Japanese Imperial Navy in the Pacific during the Second World War. Now, during the war, around 65 ships were sunk within the lagoon, and today 17 of those are considered Category 1 potentially polluting wrecks on our list of 55. So really quite a concentration of those high-risk wrecks. Now, in June 2019, I travelled to Chuuk to begin an initial assessment of the potentially polluting wrecks there. And today I just want to focus on one wreck in particular, and that is the Rio de Janeiro Maru. Now, this ship was launched in 1929, and during the Second World War served as a submarine tender for the Imperial Japanese Navy before being sunk in Chuuk Lagoon in 1944 by US aircraft. Now, in order to assess the pollution potential of the wreck, we undertook a non-disturbance photographic and video survey of the wreck. So this was undertaken over 4 days and revealed that the vessel was lying on its starboard side, between 12 and 35 metres deep. And interestingly, in contrast to historical sources, which said that it had been blown apart amidships, it was intact from bow through to stern. Now, as you can see here, one of the outcomes of the survey was this 3D model of the wreck, and this was generated from 7,350 high-resolution images. Now, this is the first shipwreck in Chuuk Lagoon to be recorded in this way, and the model has proven to be just an amazing asset, not only for us for assessing the condition of the wrecks, but also communicating the size and the scale of the threat it presents to people who don't necessarily dive and won't ever necessarily experience this kind of shipwreck. And that in Chuuk, in FSM, this includes some of the organisations who are responsible for the management of these wrecks. They aren't able to access them like we could. So through this 3D model, we could show them what we're meaning about potentially polluting shipwrecks and what the scale of the threat is that is right on their doorstep. So from this baseline survey, we were able to evaluate the integrity of the Rio de Janeiro Maru's hull, and which was used to complete a likelihood of oil release assessment. Now, essentially, what's really great about this is that it's a standardized approach of investigating potentially polluting wrecks. It was developed by CFAS in the UK, which is the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquacultural Science. And it's used by the British Ministry of Defence for their shipwrecks. We're using it as a tool for the shipwrecks in our part of the world. Other groups have taken it up in the Baltic. Now, what's interesting about this is because it is a standardized approach, is that we can look at the criteria of these shipwrecks. You can see in front of you there the specifics of the Rio, and we can then compare them to other shipwrecks around the world. For example, the Royal Oak up in Scarpa Flow and various other ones. So when we're discussing these issues as colleagues across the world, we're talking in the same language with the same understanding of the risk of oil spill from these wrecks. Now, evidently, I guess the fact that the Rio de Janeiro Maru is believed to have a high likelihood of releasing oil in the future is a considerable environmental concern. So the wreck itself is located adjacent to areas of mangroves, which are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of oil spills. What oil does to mangroves, it comes in and it actually soaks into the roots and kills them. When the plants fall over, the oil gets re-released essentially back into the marine environment. So essentially it can have like a double or even more opportunity to cause damage. So mangroves are very sensitive. Coral reefs, another very sensitive aspect as well. And what we see is that at a broader level, I'll just go back to that, the Rio and the other potentially polluting wrecks in the lagoon, they present a significant threat to the livelihoods of the Chuukese people, because many of them rely on locally caught fish for subsistence and income. It's also worth mentioning that prior to COVID, dive tourism was the largest earner of foreign income for the country. So going forward, and assuming that picks back up, the fact that these wrecks have volumes of oil is a really quite large threat to that tourism economy going forward. Okay, so I guess the question from there is, well, what are we doing with that information to actually further try and mitigate this threat? Well, following the results of the non-disturbance survey and the likelihood of oil release assessment, we had, I guess, hard evidence. We had information that we could share that these wrecks were a genuine threat. The amount of oil on them, was a concern. And what we've done is we've reached out, because we now had evidence of this, we've reached out to the various authorities within FSM, within Chuuk as well. And you can see the names of the organisations there. And essentially what we're doing is working in collaboration to prepare a project into the future where we can partner together to mitigate the threat of PPW in Chuuk. So the question is, what does that project look like? And again, really significantly, the great thing is we can take those best parts of international best practice and apply them into a Pacific context, in this case with FSM. So the proposed works that we're developing, it's really focused on building capacity within Micronesia to actually enable these authorities to effectively manage their potentially polluting wrecks. So the idea behind this is that we'll be working in collaboration and helping, I guess, to build their capacity by sharing our expertise and our knowledge of how to firstly record these shipwrecks. So looking to put together a baseline of understanding of what condition they're in. And this will be done by working with divers from the Chuuk Historic Preservation Office and Department of Marine Resources to survey the various potentially polluting wrecks, those 17 wrecks I kind of mentioned before. Now, what this will do is then this information will form the basis of that second point there of management plans. They will assess the preservation issues facing the wrecks, what condition it is, are there any significant visible threats to its preservation, and also work out the environmental threat that it poses. This then builds onto that third step, the disaster risk reduction strategy. And for us, this is a really important aspect. Essentially, 17 shipwrecks. What we could do if there was unlimited resources, you'd bring in a ship, pump out the oil, take away the problem. Unfortunately, resources are anything but unlimited, and it's unlikely that all the oil is going to be removed from these wrecks before they spill, before they cause a pretty significant incident. So through a disaster risk strategy, we can work with the FSM authorities, the Environmental Protection Agency, and look at their procedures and plans, the equipment available to them, and help them put that together so that they can react as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible to any spills in the future, and in that way reduce the impact that it may have. Moving on to that fourth point there, the production of remediation action plans. So if the wrecks we assess, they do have significant volumes of oil that would be ideally removed through a remediation process such as that hot tapping with the divers removing the oil, we can put together a plan on how that could actually happen into the future and just remove that threat of marine pollution from the wrecks in their entirety. So it's this collaborative model that we see as being most effective, as well as SPREP and our connections in Micronesia and the Marshall Islands and the Solomon Islands. It's all about working together to manage this problem, because the threat, it's too serious to be addressed without local engagement, and it's too complex to overcome without international support. So really quite a challenging situation, but through this collaborative approach, we can make things happen. Now, looking, I guess, into the future, the time for this work, it really is now. Small island developing states, which all of these countries are, they're in a particular, I guess, political and geopolitical context where they are significantly, they're really important at the moment, essentially. They do have more leverage than what they've had previously, and a lot of interest is in these countries to do with climate change mitigation and all of these things. So building on that momentum, also looking at aspects such as the Sustainable Development Goals 14.1. The goal here is to prevent and significantly reduce marine pollution of all kinds by 2025. If there's thousands of these shipwrecks throughout the world, that goal it's not going to be achieved without some significant resourcing and attention being paid. Skipping down to the bottom there, we've also just entered the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. So this is a 10-year period which essentially must focus on fixing the ocean. An enormous challenge, but significantly at the middle of that, challenge one is understanding essentially potentially polluting wrecks fits so closely within that one that it makes perfect sense. So bringing all of this together, from my presentation, I hope you've picked up a bit about this concept of the Anthropocene, where we as humans are the primary agents of ecological change on a global scale. I've also illustrated how the tools of maritime archaeology can be used, and I'm using, to investigate the anthropogenic impact of potentially polluting wrecks and seeking ways to reduce the impacts of these shipwrecks into the future. So I guess based on all of this, what I'd like you to take away from my presentation today is that it's not a matter of if, but when these wrecks will negatively impact the environment, the people and the economies of the Pacific. But we can reduce the risk these wrecks pose using methods and techniques that are already in use internationally. Again, relying on that international best practice and bringing that into a Pacific context. And there is still hope. As I mentioned earlier, we are working in partnership with SPREP and the Ocean Foundation to mitigate the threat that PPWs pose. But we're always looking for new collaborators and partners. So if you're interested in helping to tackle this urgent and critical threat, please get in touch, because the cost of doing nothing is simply too much. Thank you.